Hey everyone, Dr. Brian Schwab here with your athletic prescription of the week. This week we're going to talk about when can I return to running? So this is a question I get all the time from my patients as well as my training clients, and it's something I want to address this week to help you understand what you need to do to return to running after an injury or when you're currently going through an injury. Now, if you're also a coach or a clinician watching this is something you can go through with your patients, clients to understand how to actually start to build a program to return to running. So if you haven't watched any of my athletic prescriptions of the week before, my name is Dr. Brian Schwabe. I'm a board certified sports physical therapist, author, strength coach, and the founder of BrianSchwabeDPT.com. So my mission is really to help empower you to understand what you're supposed to do around your injuries, maintain your athleticism, and just improve your fitness. So again, today's topic is all going to be about returning to running post-injury or during your injury. So let's go into the 5 factors that are really important to understand when you're trying to get back to running. The first one is going to be the pathology or the stage of the injury. So for example, if you have a bony injury like a stress fracture or some type of stress reaction or even an acute tendon issue versus some type of muscle strain, that's going to play a role in determining when you can return to injury, right? If you're having a bone injury, for example, and I have, let's say, a stress fracture of my tibia, I can't load that up in the beginning. There's no way you can work around that. You got to build up through time and strength, right? Whereas if I have a muscle strain, I'm probably gonna be able to return to running a little bit quicker, even if it's in smaller doses. So you have to consider that factor early on when you're trying to think about returning to running. The second factor to consider is your irritability level. So for example, if you are going about your day-to-day and you're walking around or going up and down stairs and you're having pain, then chances are you can't load up enough with running to return to running anytime soon. So that's gonna play a role when we're trying to think about returning to running and building that program out. Now the factor number 3 is going to be basically your run tolerance and your previous chronic workload or your current acute workload. Now what does that mean? Okay, this is where this big factor is come into play. And we're going to talk about this specifically in a minute. This is really about understanding where your ability to have that workload built up from running over time is actually at and where you're currently at post-injury. So let's come back to that in a little bit and we'll go through specifics with that. The fourth one is your stage of competition. So if you're in the off season versus in season, it's going to play a big role in this risk reward factor of, hey, when do we push the running? When do we not push the running? And that's really going to be something that's going to be on an individual basis. So for example, if you're a basketball player and it's the end of the season, you're probably going to play a little bit more risky with pushing your running to get back to it. And it's going to be okay to do that. However, there's still going to be guidelines you want to consider versus if it's the off season, you're going to want to gradually load up again so you can actually get back to running full time. Now your last one is going to be going through the actual impairments around running. So that's your strength, your range of motion, your motor control, your ability to just, produce power and force, which is a lot of times what running is all about. You're basically bounding from one leg to another. So you have to have those basic factors. Now also, there's a link below in my comments that I always put that's basically a free guide with a bunch of athletic prescriptions as well as 10 orthopedic screens that you can go through yourself to test some of those things out to see if you have the basics. So go ahead and take a look at that link if you want more information on that. But let's dive back into the main one I want to focus on today, which is this return to running part. Okay, so the third factor, your run tolerance and your chronic workload. Okay, so let's go through what that actually means. So this first one, assessing your readiness to return to running, okay? So how do we do that, all right? So I'm gonna talk about the factors that you have to consider from my perspective over the course of the 10 plus years I've been in this field to understand what you actually need to go through. So let's talk about the biomechanics of that. So for me, there's a couple things. You have to be able to single leg squat 10 times. You have to be able to do at least 20 single leg calf raises. You have to be able to go through a series of 4-way mini bounding drills. You have to be able to jog in place for a minute. And then finally, you have to be able to bound forward and backwards without any type of issues. So these are things that I want to go through just real quickly to show you what those actually look like, because those are basically the foundation of running. If you're going through a running, for even a minute, you're basically bounding from one leg to another in a single leg squat position constantly. You're pushing off that calf at least 20 times in the first minute. These are some of the reasons why I go through this. These biomechanical things that we're going through are actually in the research, and there's no science to it per se, but there is an art to it. You have to have these basics to be able to run and produce that force. So let's go through that really quickly. So the first thing we're gonna go through is you're gonna be going through a single leg squat, okay? So what you're gonna do here is you're going to balance on one leg. You want your hips level. You want your trunk to lean back and forth. You want your hips, knee, and ankle to stay in alignment when you go through the single leg squat. Now what we're gonna be doing is we're gonna go through it 10 times. And I'm actually just gonna go through it 5 times just so you get an idea of what it looks like. You wanna be able to get to about 45 degrees because when you're jogging, you're basically getting 45 degrees every time you do that, minimum, okay? If you can get lower, even better. But start with that. Put your hands either on your hips or right in front of you. It doesn't matter what you do as long as you test it in one way. And you're just sitting down into that single leg squat and coming back up. Back and forth 5 times. You're trying to make sure you maintain hip alignment, trunk alignment, okay? Not sure you're swaying back and forth. Hip, knee, and ankle alignment, making sure everything's in a nice straight line, and your ability to do that without pain, okay? Now the last thing I want to talk to you about with that particular test is if you can't do that, okay, without falling forward, or if you have that preference to drive your knee forward, that might tell you you're very quad dominant. Whereas if you can sit back into it, it tells you you're using your hips a little bit more. And that might not be super important in the beginning, but it's going to tell you a little bit more about your body's ability to produce force from different areas of the body. So you got to be able to single leg squat for 10. You got to be able to calf raise for 20. So holding on to anything for that, just for a balance point, and going up and doing a single leg calf raise. So I'll show you what that looks like for 5 or 10 reps, just so you get an idea. You're holding on, calf raising up. Okay, so I'm just doing it 5 times, but I just want you to get the idea of that, okay? And most of the time, what I'll see with people is that they're pushing through the outer part of their feet versus the inner part of their feet, meaning that they're not getting that big toe to extend up and push off, okay? So just something to consider. Try to push through that big toe when you're doing the single leg calf raises. Make sure you have about equal height on both sides. You can always video yourself doing it. So single leg squat, single leg calf raise. Now we want to go through just mini bounding drills, okay? So that means forward, backwards, side to side, okay? So for this one, okay, and I'm going to move this briefly out of the way so you can see me. Okay, you want to be able to hop forward, hop backwards, hop side to side, and repeat that 5 times. And the reason why I do this is because it tells me a little bit about your ability to load in different planes of motion, and also to control hip, knee, and ankle. A lot of people, when I test that out, they're all over the place. They can't control that load. And if you can't control that load over your running course of time, you're gonna have more problems because biomechanically you're not sound, okay? So you gotta be able to do that 4-way bounding drill, 5 reps per side minimum, okay? And again, is there an exact science to that? No, but it's probably the minimum you're gonna go through within the first 1 or 2 minutes of your running, so you should be able to absorb those forces. And then finally, just bounding forward, taking a step, coming back, taking a step, coming back. So this is a little bit more specific with those jumps, back and forth, so you can actually see if you can produce that force and absorb the force. Lastly, jogging in place for about a minute, okay? If you can't do this, chances are you're not ready to return to running at all. Okay, so those are the ways you actually assess your ability to return to running from a minimum right there. Okay, so the next ones I want to talk about. We went through assessing your readiness to return to running. Now we want to talk about determining your chronic running workload. Okay, what does that mean? Okay, so again, if in the past you're a marathon runner and you're doing 50, 60, 70 miles a week, okay, your chronic workload in the beginning was a lot higher. If you're 2 to 4 weeks post-injury, all of a sudden that chronic workload is a little bit lower, and your acute workload, meaning your ability to run for that distance, is a lot lower. So you have to consider that when returning to running. You can't just assume I'm ready to go. It'd be like if you went and took your phone and you saw it had 15% on it left, it's not gonna last very long, okay? So you can't try to just push it and make it last to about 50%. You gotta charge it up again. And that means slowly grading yourself into that exposure to running again, which is that third one, okay? Plan a gradual return to running with graded exposure. Graded exposure just means that you're returning to running slowly. So in the beginning, I have somebody start with running for 5 minutes, okay? Just to see what they can tolerate. And I assess their symptoms over the next 24 hours. So if in 24 hours you're having no symptoms, you can bump it up 10%, okay? And you can, if you're a little bit less irritable, you can probably bump it up 20%, but 10% is just a general rule. Again, there's no science to that. It's just a general rule that we use just to see in the beginning and have slow control over it. Now, if you're having symptoms, okay, and you're between 0 and 3 on the pain scale, that's usually a safe zone, okay? As long as that is gone or back to normal, which is like a 1 or 2 for you, in 24 hours, you can bump it up again. If it's a 4 to 6, you're in that caution zone, so be a little bit careful, see how your symptoms are in 24 hours. If they're down between a 0 and 3 again, you're okay. If they're still around the 4 to 5, then you probably need to back off a little bit. If you're in that 6 to 10, you can't do it, okay? It's too much, you're excessive, you're putting way too much load on your body just not prepared for that. So again, these are just general guidelines, but if you don't address those general guidelines, it's really difficult to be able to go through it, okay? So lastly, monitor your response to running and adjust as needed. We just briefly talked about that, okay? So again, using that pain scale, seeing what your symptoms are like over a 24-hour period is really gonna help you out. And then again, every single week or every single time you're doing it, 10% bump up within a week times period, right? So if you start at 5 minutes, you bump it up 10% the next week and you slowly keep building it up. But you can also go through a spike in workload and have 1 week after a couple weeks bump up by 20%, because then you can actually start to work on a little bit more tolerance to running, okay? So this is the return to running criteria that you have to consider. These are my suggestions. Again, everyone's an individual, but that's why I wanted to go through just some general guidelines and factors to consider so that you can make the best informed decision on your own or with your local physio team or sports medicine team. So if you have more questions on return to running, please comment below in the links or email me, brianschwabingdpt@gmail.com. Thanks for watching.